In the pursuit of writing, it is best to find professionals and people who have success in that field to learn from and to better your own craft. Today, that professional is C.S. Lewis. We have his On Writing and Writers. This is a book that when I first got it, I was given it as a gift. I assumed that it was written by C.S. Lewis himself. It's technically not. It is a collection of letters that he wrote to fans or family or other authors, other writers about the craft of writing. And so there's excerpts from his life from earlier on when he was in the process of writing different stories. So while it's not technically a book about writing exclusively from his words themselves, him sitting down exclusively to say, here's a guide on writing tips, it's more of a collection of those writing tips that he had sent to other people over the years. So written by C.S. Lewis, but sort of in a roundabout way. But I'm not going to go super in depth into the whole thing, but there were a few tips that I found were really valuable and made a lot of sense to me as I read through it. The first 2/3 of the book are about writing, and the last bit is kind of Lewis's commentary on other works of fiction, other authors, and kind of what he thinks about those. And some of those are really interesting, but there's not that much of substance as far as how to be a better writer, other than his just critiques or praise on some of these works. So this is a very, very short volume. I don't know the cost of it. It was given to me as a gift, as I said. I'm sure you can find it online pretty easily. But I think this is worth looking at if you're looking at bettering yourself as a writer, as an author, as somebody involved in the written word. And C.S. Lewis, he's written a lot of really famous, very impactful, very well-received works. And so he surely has some things of value to say. Let's get into it. Right out of the gate, he's got 5 tips of writing advice. Point 4 of this list, he says, in writing, don't use adjectives which merely tell us how you want us to feel about the thing you are describing. Instead of telling us a thing was terrible, describe it so that we'll be terrified. And then he goes on and makes a couple more examples. I think that's a really, really good point, a really good way to start off this book here. And I can do this a lot in my own writing where I'm trying to describe something is incredible. And so I'll just say, this was an incredible view instead of describing why it's incredible and then letting the reader decide for themselves. So I think that's a really good point. Lewis has a moment where he talks about directness, and he's talking about style here and how important it is to mean what you say and say that thing exclusively. He makes the metaphor of driving sheep towards a pasture. And if they're going down a lane and there's open gates on either side of the lane, there's a chance that those sheep will go into one of those open gates. And the goal is to not do that, to get them to go straight right down the lane there. And I think if you taking that metaphor to the writing world, if I try to be too ambivalent, if I try to be too abstract in what I'm saying, there's a chance that the reader can withdraw something that isn't the intention. Now, I know that there's some sense of your own interpretation in a story and what the thing means to you, but that's more of a extrapolation on the meaning that's a bigger and the broader sense of things that you might pull from something, the way you feel, that kind of esoteric nature of a story, I think. And what Lewis is talking about here is a little bit more defined maybe. And so when you have a chance to direct your reader in a certain way, because that's the way the story's going, you should try to be more direct and more honest and more forthright in the certain path that you need them to take, to not open up these different channels of, I wonder what they're saying, because you don't want them to be confused. I think that's the point he's trying to make. And I think that's a valuable point to make. And I think that's a valuable thing to think about when we're doing our own writing. He has a really interesting point about abstract and simplicity. This sort of goes along with his previous point that I mentioned about being direct when you were supposed to be direct. He says the more abstract the topic, the less abstract the prose. So if it's something that is very out there, something in the science fiction or the fantasy realm or in the horror world, something that is very strange and unnatural, you can use language that is simple to understand because the subject itself is so out there. And conversely, if it's something as simple as a living room, you can describe that living room in an abstract way to give it color and life, to separate it from other living rooms if that's the purpose. And so I think that's an interesting point. I don't know that checks and tracks in every circumstance, because sometimes you want to use very verbose language to describe something that is extravagant and out there and otherworldly, because it makes sense and you're trying to paint this almost musical picture. But sometimes it does make sense. You need to You need to be very direct and very simple because the subject matter itself is so broad. So I think that's an interesting point and something to think about. And I think it kind of goes back with his previous point about being direct, knowing the thing that you're trying to say, and saying that without giving too much wiggle room for other interpretations. In the middle part of the book, he has a big section talking about children's books and writing for children. And the big thing that he tries to say in this part of the story is when you write for children, if it's only good for children, it's not a good story. If the book is only accessible to children, to young people, if they're the only ones who like it and would want to read it, you haven't written something that is good. And I think that's an interesting point because something like the Narnia series, adults love those as well. And some of the young adult, books, I mentioned Harry Potter earlier. If there's plenty of adults who read Harry Potter and enjoy it, and whether that's the same literary bounds as something bigger, it's not Leo Tolstoy, but it's well written, it's entertaining. There's points A, B, and C. The story hits those points, and it's done very well. So I think this is an interesting point that he brings up here. He compares children's writing to a waltz. He says a waltz which you can only like while waltzing is a bad waltz, and I think that's just a good point. If there's a song that comes out and it's a song for dancing and it only is good when you're dancing, then it's not a great song. It should be good all the time. And so in the children's book world, and I think that can maybe even translate to young adults, there's certainly things that will be more impactful to children than they will be to adults. But I think there should still be some level of quality that you strive for in your writing that would translate to adults and they would see that as well. And so you can do a good job in whoever your audience is. And I think that's just something to think about, that and something that I want to think about as well, because in writing middle grade, in writing young adults, and kind of broadening my horizons to multiple age groups within the fantasy science fiction genres, I want to write something that is accessible to those groups. And maybe that is how the prose is, and maybe I shift things a little bit. But certainly some of the content, you wouldn't want to have excessive violence in a middle grade book. But the way it's written and the story that I'm telling should be good and should be valuable and should be entertaining to multiple age groups. I think that's the point Lewis is trying to make. He has a good point towards the end of his writing advice section, talking about tips, where he says that if there's no point in having a location set in a science fiction world, an extravagant, exotic world, then don't have it written there. Don't have it set there. And I think that seems to me to be pretty good advice. If we don't need to be on Mars, why are we on Mars? And so if it doesn't serve the purpose of the story, set it in a world that's a little bit more easy to write and easy to understand. And so I think that to me is, it depends. It's hard because in our current state of fantasy fiction, sometimes the world is the sell. That's the thing that people are coming for. And so, you go into a book and you go, wow, the world building is phenomenal. It's incredible. It's, it's like you're walking through a painting, and the story is almost secondary to that. And for some people, that's really good, and that's what they like. For me personally, I want my stories to be the thing that people come back for, and rather than necessarily than the world building. And obviously, your setting to be compelling as well and to make sense. But I think what he's saying is don't just write a setting. Don't just be an artist. Also be an author and put those two things together. And so, in his space trilogy, it made sense to go to this other planet because he learned about these other alien creatures, and that is what drives the story, and that wouldn't happen on Earth. And so that's the important part of it. But if he just went there and he was an accountant and I'm just going to go to this alien planet and I'm going to do accounting for them, well, you could do that on Earth. You don't need to have to be aliens, especially if they're not doing anything interesting that is unique to this alien life. And so I think what he's saying there is just, don't use something just for the sake of it being flashy and bright. Use something because it's necessary to the story. So those are a few of the bits of advice that C.S. Lewis has in this collection of letters and excerpts from his writings about writing itself. C.S. Lewis is the master. He's written a lot. His theology books are awesome, and some of them are really, really cool and unique. And the idea of how he came across writing them, very cool. And obviously his fantasy books, his science fiction books, he's just done a lot. And so he has some good things to say. I think this is worth picking up if you're looking for advice and tips on writing. And if you don't like what he's saying, at the very least, it'll make you think about your own writing, which I think is always valuable. So that's my review. That's my, I guess, more of my synopsis on writing by C.S. Lewis. I think it's a 5 out of 5. It's not really necessarily one for reviewing in the same way for entertainment purposes. It's very quick. It's very short to get through. You can just see how small it is there. I think it's like 160 pages, but it's very small. I mean, we're not talking about a big book, and the last third is mostly just his thoughts on other stories. So pick it up if you're looking for something to give you some ideas on writing. And until the next video, thanks for watching. We'll see you then.